Time for the discussion has expired. The Senate will now consider the proposal from Senator Bragg, which is also shown at item 12 on today's order of business. Is the proposal supported? Thank you very much. I understand that informal arrangements have been made to allocate specific times to each of the speakers in today's debate. With the concurrence of the Senate, I ask the clerks to set the clock accordingly, and I call Senator Bragg.
Deputy President. Well, I rise to make a contribution on this very important matter of public importance, which is in relation to the competency of the Assistant Treasurer. And I note the last contribution from Senator McKim. We also heard from Senator McKim on Friday, who set out some of the issues that members of this place have been having in their engagement with the Assistant Treasurer. And it appears as if a deal with Mr Jones is not worth the paper it's written on. But in relation to this minister's maladministration of this portfolio, there are a litany of examples which I seek to catalogue today for the Senate's consideration. Now, of course, the matter before us is the FAR bill, the FAR package of bills, which is about ensuring that financial executives are held to account under Australian law, that there are appropriate penalties where there is problems that they preside over, where there are problems which they preside over, I should say. Now, this bill has been totally botched by Mr Jones. Of course, this bill also contains the compensation scheme of last resort, which I would say is a very interesting idea indeed, that the Commonwealth should compensate where there has been a problem in the market, which may have been caused by a market operator, or it may have been caused by a regulator not doing its job. But the point is that Mr Jones in opposition campaigned for much higher compensation caps in relation to this bill, but when he introduced the bill himself as a minister, of course, he reverted back to the position that the coalition had in government. So Mr Jones again showing that he is unable to keep a position for a period of time. But of course, when you reflect upon his tenure as the Minister for Financial Services and the Assistant Treasurer, Mr Jones's first priority was to strip transparency from superannuation payments to unions and to banks and insurance companies. Mr Jones has chosen to remove transparency in a compulsory savings scheme, which is a remarkable turn of events, that someone would come into a new portfolio and as their first act remove the ability of a person, a worker, to see where their own money is being sent. That is a remarkable beginning. Now, of course, Mr Jones, of course, has had another defeat today, with the government deciding that it would remove from its own legislation the faith-based carve-out, which Mr Jones proposed in opposition. Now, this policy, which was his main policy in superannuation, this is his key policy, he took to the election, a carve-out from the superannuation performance test for religious-based funds, has been dropped today by Mr Jones after the Senate gave Mr Jones some advice. Now, I note the contributions of Senator Smith and McKim during the committee process. The Senate told Mr Jones that it was not going to be able to support this strange idea that someone in a religious-based fund, of which there are only a few, should be prepared to accept a poorer return than a person in a non-religious-based fund. A very interesting precedent indeed for someone who has spent most of their career arguing the virtues of compulsory super. Now, if I was a great supporter of the compulsory superannuation scheme, I would not be wanting to open it up to these sort of precedents, because once you open the door to one idea that is not about the best financial performance of the fund, then you open the floodgates to every crazy idea. And I can assure the Senate that there are many crazy ideas in relation to the expenditure of superannuation funds. Of course, today we look at the Australian Financial Review, and there is an article referring to Mr Jones, which is called "Mr Jones is out of his depth," and it says here, across the Albanese government, the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, stands out like dog's paws. It goes on to say that in the 6 months since he took charge of the ministry, the member for Whitlam has chewed up the furniture, rubbed his bum on the carpet and cocked his leg over his parliamentary colleagues, the financial sector and the voters of Australia. Now, that is in the financial review today, and I think it's a pretty fair assessment, actually, of Mr Jones's tenure, that, of course, after having removed the transparency requirements for super, failed to protect consumers in the superannuation sector, failed to deliver any cryptocurrency reforms, and, of course, now having lost his key policy, the religious carve-out for the super funds, which, of course, there are only 2 funds, none of which have my super funds. That is a remarkable tenure, maybe the worst Assistant Treasurer ever.
Thank you, Senator Bragg. Senator Ayres.
Well, I mean, goodness gracious me. I mean, here we are. It's obviously, you know, term 4, right? Everybody's tired and got the sillies. This is the greatest effort at insider baseball that you could imagine. This is the week where the government is going to introduce sensible reforms in industrial relations that are going to make the country a better place, are going to be good for our workplaces. This is the week that the government's going to introduce you know, what the last government couldn't bring itself to do, reforms to introduce a National Integrity Commission, the National Anti-Corruption Commission. This is the week where, you know, the modern Liberal Party, which had decided to tie its fortunes to the bunch of sort of ratbags and nutters and conspiracy theorists who are enlarging themselves in the Liberal Party's base in Victoria, decide to tie themselves to, you know, some people who you wouldn't want to have a beer with, really, like you'd avoid at parties, the sort of extremists, the extremist takeover of the Victorian Liberal Party, and they've seen the culmination, the impact of that, you know, that strategy. What was the outcome? Well, re-election of the Andrews government, less Liberals, a few more Nationals, and they've preferenced straight home and elected a few more Greens and a few inner-city seats. I mean, what utter genius! So in this week, where we're going to see the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, being censured, what's Senator Bragg in here talking about? I mean, some arcane issue to do with the negotiation of financial sector reform. And when you look at the backdrop, you look at the backdrop to this. What is the real backdrop to this? What's really going on? The previous government, and before that, the previous government before that, resisted, like fought tooth and nail, the idea of having the Hayne Royal Commission. They didn't want it. They didn't want it to happen, to protect the interests of people who had done unscrupulous things in the financial services sector. Senator Bragg's friends done unscrupulous things. The interests he's in here trying to protect. Now remember, they fought so hard to stop there being a proper inquiry into all of those matters, and then finally they're forced, dragged kicking and screaming into having a Royal Commission headed by former Justice Hayne, who did a very solid piece of work, very careful piece of work. I mean, and don't forget the photos. I mean, there's a whole lot of bring back Josh sort of stuff going on now in Victoria, right? Bring back Josh. We had an incremental few degrees. Oh, don't worry, I'm coming back to the topic. Don't you worry about that. So all the bring back Josh stuff. I mean, if something goes really badly, try it again. I urge the Victorian Liberal Party to do that. That'd be good. We can never forget the photos of Justice Hayne and the former Treasurer. I've never seen a more unhappy couple. You know, one who actually believed in proper financial regulation, one who was actually doing everything that he could to avoid it. And then we saw the sorry months and years that followed that announcement. like no reform, like nothing happened. And now we've got a government that in a steady, careful, methodical way is introducing reforms. Now, reform's difficult, but I find this MPI resolution really interesting. It's got 2 sentences in it. Within those 2 sentences, it attacks the government for not consulting and then condemns the government for consulting. I mean, this is an incoherent, out of place, misconceived MPI. I expect that we'll see many more of them in 2023.
Thank you, Senator Ayres. Senator McKim.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I placed the facts of this matter on the record in this chamber last week, and I don't intend to labour them, but without any shadow of a doubt, the Assistant Treasurer and I did have an agreement to include in the financial accountability regime civil penalties for people who breach their accountability obligations. But what we saw last week was not just Labor refusing to honour an agreement. It was one of those moments when Australians got a bit of a peek through the curtains at who actually runs this place. Last week was as transparent an exercise of power by the big business community in this country as you would ever want to see. Within 24 hours of the agreement going public to put million-dollar fines on dodgy bankers who ripped off their customers, the Labor Party folded in a screaming heap under the weight of lobbying by the big banks. Now, I remind people these are the very banks who donated well north of $400,000 in the last 12 months that we have donations data for in this country. I'll tell you what, money talks, and it talks very loudly indeed in this place. The other thing is, it was the way the banks steamrolled the Labor Party. They weren't even slightly shy or ashamed about it. They were naked in their exercise of power. In fact, they wanted everyone in this place to see that they made the government renege on the agreement. The banks wanted everyone in the duopoly here, Labor and the LNP, who might be thinking about pushing for something that curbs bankers' power, who might be wanting to tilt the scales in favour of the customers and against the big bankers, to know that in fact it is the big bankers who are in charge of this place. And my word, they've got the Labor Party on a short leash. We saw that last week. Now, they don't really need the Liberal Party on a leash because they've been bred to be loyal to the big banks, which is why Senator Bragg's motion is, quite frankly, a little bit of rubbish. The inclusion of civil penalties for individuals who breach their accountability obligations was consulted on by the former government, was the subject of consideration by the Senate Economics Committee into both the previous government's and this government's bill. So the idea that it's come out of nowhere is absolute tosh. The policy is straightforward, the public benefit is abundantly clear to the public, and we now know the only people who don't want million-dollar fines for dodgy bankers who rip off their customers are the dodgy bankers who rip off their customers that have both the major parties in this place right where they want them.
Thank you, Senator McKim. Senator Scarr.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Well, I must say Senator McKim is more forgiving of the Assistant Minister than I would be in his place, and I was quite staggered. I was surprised when I heard the circumstances of the deal that was reneged on. Now, I first heard the term reneged when I used to play cards with my grandparents, and this was the first time I heard the term reneged. You played the wrong card. You were meant to play a card of a certain club or whatever, and you played a heart, so you reneged. That's the first time I heard the term reneged, and that's what's happened in this case. And I want to quote from the Sydney Morning Herald article of 24 November 2022, written by Rachel Clun, because my main concern with this is I can understand, or I can try to understand, how the Assistant Treasurer met with Senator McKim, and maybe he did a deal he shouldn't have done, and I could understand if he actually then approached Senator McKim and said to Senator McKim, "I'm sorry about that, I overstepped the mark, I didn't really understand the consequences of what I was doing, the Treasurer's come down on me like a ton of bricks, I've got to retreat. I can understand if he did that. I can understand him making a mistake. We're all human. We're all human. I could understand that. But what really distressed me, as someone who's gotten to know Senator McKim over the last 3.5 years, as a man of his word, is the Assistant Minister went to the press and said, and I quote, "Jones said there had been no final agreement on the Greens amendments, and there was clearly plenty of stakeholder concern about civil penalties. We've asked them what it would take to get their support for that and other bills," he said. "There'd been no sign-off on anything," end quote. So he actually went to the media. He actually went to the media and, in my view, cast imputations on Senator McKim. Because there are only two people in the room. Well, I don't know how many people are in the room, but there was Senator McKim and there was the Assistant Treasurer. They can't both be right. And Senator McKim said in the same article, and I quote, "There was 100% categorically a deal. We looked each other in the eye and shook hands," he said. "If the minister is saying there was no agreement, he is not fit to be a minister. This is a disgraceful move to renege," there's that word, renege, "on our agreement," end quote. So only one of them can be right. Only one of them can be right. We're here in this chamber. We all know Senator McKim. I take Senator McKim at his word. I take Senator McKim at his word, absolutely. And I query, why didn't the Assistant Treasurer come out and just honestly say he overstepped the mark? He made a mistake. Why didn't he do that? Why did he actually come out and say there was no final agreement when Senator McKim is so certain that there was an agreement? Why do that? Why cast aspersions on one of our fellow senators? It was totally unnecessary, and to me, that is the most concerning thing about this whole matter, that when a senator from this place, and I don't care which party, actually approaches a member of the executive and raises legitimate concerns, and the concerns Senator McKim raises in this space. I was chair of the Economics Committee, so I was part of the reporting process in the last parliament of looking at this legislation. It's a very legitimate concern in relation to the level of civil penalties that senior executives in our banking industry should rightly face in the course of material, and we're talking about material misconduct. And some of the things that came out of the Hayne Royal Commission were absolutely horrifying. Horrified me as an ex-company secretary and general counsel of a publicly listed company. Horrified me. But what concerns me is every senator in this place, when they approach a member of the executive to have a discussion about proposed amendments to a piece of legislation, they should actually know or have faith with the member of the executive that they'll stay true to their bargain, that they'll deliver on the deal. That's the way this place needs to work. It can't work otherwise. If you can't trust the members of executive to stay true to their word when you engage with them on a matter such as this. So that is the thing which most disturbs me, that a member of this place, a senator in this place who cares passionately about this matter, went in and had a discussion with the Assistant Treasurer, in good faith thought they had a deal, and then the Assistant Treasurer tips a bucket on him in the Sydney Morning Herald in the public media. Absolutely astounding, and I think all senators should be concerned about this.
Thank you, Senator Scarr. Senator Roberts.
Thank you. It seems Stephen Jones is to the Labor Party as Josh Frydenberg was to the Liberals, the bank's man in the government. Whether it's defending the right of the banks to bail in the cash in your account, whether it's turning a blind eye to banks closing their rural bank branches, which have increased this year under Minister Jones, or it's allowing the King's currency to be shunned so the banks can force everyone onto electronic banking, with every transaction helping bank profits and every sale providing a data and profit-rich environment for the banks. Or, as it is today, with letting banking executives off the hook for egregious behaviour that should be criminal. These hideous, inhuman banking crimes were brought to light during the Senate's Select Committee into Lending to Primary Production Customers in 2018, an inquiry that Senator Pauline Hanson got and that I chaired. 4 years later, not one of those victims has been compensated, nor a banker prosecuted. Minister Chalmers is protecting the banks over the best interests of the people.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Senator Walsh.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. And I'd really like to thank Senator Bragg for the opportunity to talk about failures of measured policy development and administration in this place, as per the terms of his motion, because when it comes to failures of policy development and administration, there is, of course, no better example than those opposite, starting indeed with the very legislation that is the subject of this motion, the Financial Accountability Regime legislation, because this is actually the former government's legislation. It's legislation that they promised and that they failed to deliver, that they failed to get through their parliament. This is legislation that is based on reforms recommended by the Hayne Royal Commission. And it's legislation that just sat gathering dust under the previous government since 2019. Legislation that does some incredibly important things for consumers of financial services, including establishing an accountability regime for financial sector companies, establishing a compensation scheme of last resort for victims of financial misconduct, as well as implementing the reforms recommended by the long-outstanding 2016 review of small amount credit contracts, the SACS review. A review which said it was urgent to protect vulnerable people from being trapped in unsustainable debt spirals as a result of payday loans and consumer leases that were not operating effectively in this country. This is a series of really important legislative reforms to protect consumers that has been sitting there for years, ignored by the previous government. Those opposite basically had to wait for us to get into government to get the work done, just like they had to wait for us to get the work done on another important Royal Commission, the Aged Care Royal Commission, and its recommendations for more nurses and more care time, legislated by us, just like they waited for us to implement the findings of the Respect at Work report, just like they waited for us to take real action on climate change and legislate net zero targets. I mean, really, if you want to talk about measured policy development and administration as per the terms of this motion, then look at the Albanese Labor government and what we've delivered in the last 6 months, doing what the previous government failed to do for almost a decade. They waited for us to introduce a strong and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission, another policy that they promised and yet just failed to deliver. And let's look at the previous government's record on policy development and consultation. We all remember the appropriate consultation undertaken during the sports rorts scheme, during the commuter car park scheme. We remember the appropriate consultation for the Building Better Regions Fund, all of which had absolutely nothing to do with measured policy and everything to do with rorting public funds for political gain. So if we want to talk about measured administration, let's talk about a Prime Minister who secretly appointed himself to 5 ministries without the knowledge of the ministers themselves. How did that contribute to measured policy development and administration under the previous government? And how on earth did a motion on measured policy administration get through the opposition's processes and make its way to the floor of this chamber? Because the list of examples goes on and on and on. The legacy of the previous government is a record of policy failure, of missed opportunities and neglect, confusion and chaos, and not much, what was Senator Bragg's term, not much measured policy development and administration to be seen. And meanwhile, in just 6 months, in my 20 seconds remaining, it's impossible for me to get through what the Albanese Labor government has actually achieved. Aged Care Royal Commission reforms to deliver more nurses and more care time. legislating net zero, delivering 10 days paid family domestic violence leave, setting up Jobs and Skills Australia, repealing the nasty and harmful cashless debit card, making medicines cheaper for millions of Australians, getting wages moving for Australians. These are the measured policy responses that we—
Your time has expired. Senator Pocock.
Deputy President, I rise to speak to the urgent need for the government to relist the finance sector reform bills for debate this week. The reforms in these bills are urgent and overdue. The bills would immediately empower ASIC to go after predatory lenders that are avoiding the law. To give an example, the Indigenous Consumer Assistance Network is reporting that lender Signo is targeting First Nations people and are charging around 900% interest. 900% interest on the loans they issue. This is disgusting and clearly exploitative. We have the means to stop this. If the bill passes this week, we could go after Signo and other predatory lenders and put an end to this sector exploiting the most vulnerable in our community. I urge the government to relist the bills for consideration by the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. Senator Rennick.
Deputy President, and what can I say? This motion today is just money for jam, and it really just proves what we've been saying for a very long time, and that is the Labor Party is the party for the big end of town. And it's interesting, I'll slightly disagree with the wording of my good friend and colleague Senator Braggs, where he says the Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones to appropriately consult in regards to this. I'd actually disagree with that because, as it turns out, he got all the consulting he needed. He got a phone call from the former Queensland Labor Premier, Anna Bligh, who of course is now the head of the Australian Banking Association. Now, if you want a good example of just how close the big end of town, the banks, are to the Labor Party, look no further than who's the head of the Australian Banking Association, former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh. And what was Anna Bligh famous for up in Queensland? We call her the Minister for Privatisation. She sold all of Queensland's, all the assets that belong to the Queensland people, the Queensland forestry plantations, which are freehold, for 5 times earnings. 5 times earnings. She sold the Port of Brisbane for 6 times earnings, a 99-year lease for 6 times earnings. Gave our assets away to the mates in the big end of town and to her mates in the superannuation funds. And of course she's got her payback. She's got her 30 pieces of silver. And of course, who is the master puppet pulling the strings behind former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh? No less a person than the Minister for Agriculture at the moment, current Senator Murray Watt, who is the Chief of Staff for all this. So we know that the Labor Party is in thick with the big end of town. I mean, we hear Senator Watt talking all the time how he engages with industry groups in agriculture. Well, let me tell you, as a 6th-generation farmer, we don't engage with industry groups. We're too busy out in the paddock working to be hanging out with the big end of town, the blowhards. No, 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 no. This is not a party that cares about the workers. Let me tell you that. This is not a party that cares about the workers. And the history of the Labor Party and getting into bed with the big banks goes back, there's another great example of how they sold the CBA. And of course, Senator Ayres was talking earlier on about how there's all this bad behaviour in the big banks. I'll tell you why there was bad behaviour in the big banks, because you privatised CBA without any regulation. At the same time, you introduced superannuation, where basically people are being the workers, having their money taken from them, given to these financial planners, many of whom started working for the big banks. I mean, remember the 90s? CBA bought Colonial Mutual, National Bank bought National Mutual, Westpac did a joint venture with Bankers Trust, and ANZ did a deal with ING. So it's the big banks again. I mean, I often say that the industry super funds are out there good mates with Labor, but it's also the private sector as well that's very good mates with Labor. And of course, as I've always said, and I have to sometimes remind my colleagues on this side of the chamber, that Robert Menzies himself said in the Forgotten People speech that the rich and powerful can look after themselves. He made it very clear that we're about people that want to get out of bed every day and put their nose to the grindstone. And of course, the Minister for Stephen Jones, he doesn't know whether he's Arthur or Martha, because he's thought he was going to get in there and save the world, and he suddenly realised that the lobbyists the lobbyists, and I spoke about this last week, the Cory Mail reported it, lobbyists should disclose who pays them. It's not just political parties, because I tell you who's pulling the strings in the world. It's not us. I mean, I've often thought about engaging a lobbyist myself to get something done around here. So I can tell you what, as an elected member, I'm not getting much done, as an elected representative of the people. But let me tell you, a phone call from Anna Bligh and Stephen Jones, the Minister for Whitlam, just suddenly pulls the fees for the big end of town. And that is just so typical of the Labor Party of today. I mean, they tell me that the seismographs are going off in Bathurst where Ben Chiefeley's rolling in his grave. Rolling in his grave. King O'Malley rolling in his grave, the great man who actually started the Commonwealth Bank way back then, and it was also part of the Reserve Bank, and they actually had a business bank and they funded this stuff. So I'm very glad, and I think the Labor Party need to take a really good look at themselves, because this is not a party that stands up for the working class anymore. They are a party for the big end of town, and of course we know that. We aren't surprised, because the first thing they did, Stephen Jones did, was remove the disclosure requirements for super funds. I mean, I tell you what, this guy, he's the minister for, as the Australian Financial Review called him, the minister
Senator Rennick, your
for the
time
dogs
has
proverbial.
expired.